Hi, welcome to the fourth video in our series on discernment of spirits. My name is Father Brian Christopher. I'm a member of the Jesuit community here in Belize, and once again, it's nice to be here with you to share some thoughts on this really important topic. In this video, I want to change gears a little bit. I want to give you a few basic principles that might help you identify a bit more quickly as you're sorting through all these inner movements, these emotions and whatnot. Help you identify more quickly which of these movements are from God and which are not. And here is where discernment really becomes more of an art form. Discernment is not like following a recipe. Do these steps and you'll figure out what God is doing in your life. Discernment really is more of an art form. It's subtle. You begin to develop a gut sense of what God is doing, but the more you do it, the better you get at it. And some of these principles that I'm going to give you are going to sound really clear at first, and others are going to be vague. They're going to leave you just kind of scratching your head. So maybe instead of principles, I should call them rules of thumb, because that's probably more what they are. So here we go. Number one, always keep your focus on Christ. Keep your focus on what Christ is doing. Sometimes when we're using discernment and making a decision, we go to prayer and the prayer that we make is, Lord, what should I do? But when you pray, what should I do? Where's the attention? The attention's on me. But really, what we should be praying is, Lord, what are you doing? Maybe it wouldn't sound quite like that, but the attention needs to be on him and on what Christ is doing. And remember what we said a few videos ago. Christ is always doing something. So the first question is, what's that guy up to? And then how can I be a part of that, right? So always keep your focus on Christ. The second, be wary of strong emotions. You know, for most of us, it's kind of in our nature to see our strong emotions as an indicator of what's true, right? We tend to interpret intensity of emotion. We tend to equate that with truth. And that's true whether our emotions are comfortable or whether they feel good or whether they feel bad, right? So take the example, for instance, of falling in love, right? And for anybody who's ever been in love, what does that feel like when you meet somebody and you fall in love? It feels like, you know, you're overcome with emotion and just you're skipping around and everything looks beautiful. And because those emotions are so strong, in your head you conclude, this must be love because I feel so strongly towards this person. But what happens a little bit later on? Let's say 7 years into that relationship, what happens? Well, you find the emotions come down a little bit. They normalize a little bit. And yes, you have days that are wonderful, and you also have days that are pretty rough. Real love is not about strong emotions. Real love is a little bit more even-keeled. Huh? Or when somebody hurts you and you get really angry, and you say, that guy's horrible, that guy's a cheater, that guy's a bad person, right? And so you're drawing these conclusions about the other person. But is that the case? No, you know what? Your wounds are speaking for you. You're not really speaking from an authentic place. And you know, you give it some time, you give it a few weeks, you give it a few months, you wait for those emotional wounds to heal, and pretty soon you say, yeah, that wasn't a good situation, but he didn't know what he was doing. He didn't mean to hurt me. He didn't mean to say that to me. Okay, and then you can move on, right? Okay, so strong emotions don't really point us towards the truth reliably. And we're easily swayed by these strong emotions, though. But again, St. Ignatius of Loyola would remind us that discernments are best done when we're even-keeled. It's much easier to do discernment when our emotions aren't way up here or way down here, but when we're more in that place of equanimity, yeah? And it's best not to make decisions when you're in the grips of some strong emotion. Sometimes you're making a decision and one option seems so clear and you're so excited about it, but that doesn't mean that that's the right decision to make. That doesn't mean that that's what Christ wants you to do. So sometimes you got to wait for your emotions to kind of balance out a little bit before you can do that. Right, so secondly, be wary of strong emotions. Third, never do discernment by yourself. It doesn't work very well. We human beings are really good at rationalizing things. We're really good at talking ourselves into doing things. We're really good at deceiving ourselves. And so it always helps to have another person there whom you trust that you can bounce ideas off of. And whether that's a spiritual director or a confessor or just a good friend, but to have somebody there that you trust. And you talk to them about whatever it is that's going on in your life or whatever decision you're making, and talk with them about your different emotions and practice developing that emotional vocabulary. Try to name what those emotions are, not just say, oh, I feel good or I feel bad. And maybe most importantly, talk about what's going on in your prayer. Are you in consolation? Are you in desolation? And you're going to find that when you're talking it out loud, it's going to help you get clear inside your own head, because you'll find yourself saying things that made perfect sense in your head, but when you go to say them to another person, you say, yeah, you know what? Now that I'm saying that out loud, that really doesn't make sense. Or the flip side might happen, right? There might be something in your head that as you're sitting there thinking about it on your own, you think to yourself, that's not a very important detail. But when you're talking about it to that other person, you begin to realize, hey, wait a second, that is a really important detail. So there's something about talking to another person that helps you get clearer inside yourself, yeah? And again, that's what discernment is about, is getting clear. Fourth, when you're doing discernment, be transparent. Don't keep secrets. When you are doing a discernment, sometimes you're going to experience thoughts or feelings that you may not be proud of, and you might be tempted to keep those thoughts and feelings to yourself. But when you go and you speak to that trusted confidant, those are exactly the kinds of things that you should speak up about. St. Ignatius would say that there are certain things that the enemy really wants you to keep secret. And the enemy is going to say to you, don't worry about it. It's not so important. You don't need to tell anybody about that, right? Those are precisely the things that you need to talk about. So for instance, personal story, when I was discerning whether or not to enter the Jesuits, I was young, I was in my early 20s, and I was terrified of leaving home because my dad was sick. And I was scared that if I left home, that he would die. But I didn't want to admit that to myself, and I didn't tell anybody else about that fear that I had because I thought it made me sound kind of weak. Eventually, I got over that, and when I did finally tell my spiritual director that that's how I was feeling, again, as soon as those words came out of my mouth, I could hear, that just doesn't sound right. No, that's not right. And I was able to work through some of those feelings, of course, with God's help, right? Fifth rule of thumb. Am I being invited or am I being pushed? Okay, now this rule of thumb, this is a rule of thumb in discernment that I have found incredibly helpful, but I'll be honest with you, it's a little bit hard to describe. So when you're using discernment to make a choice in some matter, right? And you're considering one particular option, ask yourself, do I feel drawn towards that option? Do I feel invited towards that option? Or do I feel like there's something pushing me to that option? Do I feel like I'm, in a sense, being forced into something? Again, going back to the example of when I was discerning whether or not to enter the Jesuits, this was a question that came up quite a lot for me in my own prayer and spiritual conversation, right? Do I feel drawn to be a Jesuit? Or do I have some kind of guilt trip? Am I trying to make up for past sins? You know, rarely does God try to push us into one path or another, right? God doesn't use shame to get us to make decisions very often. Another example of this is, again, sometimes when we go to make big decisions with our lives, sometimes we're not doing it out of an authentic place in ourselves. Sometimes we're making these decisions in order to please somebody else. And again, in those instances, we got to say, look, am I feeling drawn to this choice, or do I feel like I'm being pushed or pressured by other circumstances in my life? More often than not, when it comes to discovering where God's path is leading us, we find that God invites us and then waits patiently for us to say yes. And that difference between feeling invited or feeling pushed, that might feel a little bit subtle. But there are times when, at least for me anyway, this distinction really helped me to sort out what was going on. So there are the 5 principles or rules of thumb that might be able to help you in your discernment. You may have a difficult time remembering them. You might have a difficult time understanding them. Maybe I didn't say them so clearly. But I think that the importance of these 5 principles will come clear the more you practice discernment. So give it a try. Thanks.